Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. This is our weekly politics live stream. And today, surprise, surprise, we're going to talk about Donald Trump's first 100 days in office. So 100 days in 30 minutes or so. And I'm joined by two excellent smarties this morning to help us sort this out, or at least try to sort it out. David Drucker, who's a writer with The Dispatch and a columnist with Bloomberg Opinion, and Nia Malika Henderson, a columnist with Bloomberg Opinion as well. Both of them cover politics and policy, and we have a lot of politics and policy to sort out here. David, few presidents have entered the White House with the wind at their back in quite the same way as Donald Trump. I could think to Lyndon Johnson in 1964, Ronald Reagan in 1984, maybe. But Trump came in with a clear electoral mandate, control of Capitol Hill, and his own peculiar and specific mojo and communication skills. And we're now at the back end of that amid tumult and chaos. Let's start at the beginning of that. And I guess for sort of a macro thought, do you think that Trump has squandered the kinds of gifts that were laid at his feet when he entered the Oval Office for the second time, or do you think it's too early to know?
Well, I think it's too early to know. I mean, if you were to look at the polling today, which, by the way, Tim, is so much different in a really important way than the polling in the first term. In his first term, the negative polling, right, the problems Trump experienced politically very quickly and sustained were based on his personality and based on things he said or said he was going to do. The polling that he's experienced now as we hit this 100-day mark is based on work product. It's based on things he has done. And that is a huge difference. And in a sense, it's an opportunity because Trump's never going to change his behavior. But his behavior, however annoying at times, has become normalized because it just feels like, okay, well, I don't know if I like it, but that's just the way he is. It's normal. He could change course on key policy issues, right? He could pull back from the trade war he started with basically every country on earth. He could make adjustments to how he's handling the mass deportations. Here I'm referring to deporting illegal immigrants to El Salvador, but without due process, right? There are a lot of people that are troubled by the lack of due process. So there are a number of changes he could make that might give voters then a different viewpoint of how he is actually governing, because the thing he can't change or will never change is something they've gotten used to. But I think what is really different, or had an opportunity to be really different about this second term, is that normally presidents enter a second term and pretty quickly voters get exhausted with them. They get exhausted with themselves, it seems, half the time, because that sustained number of years in office just tends to rub Americans the wrong way, or they get bored, or they get tired of the antics. Things don't quite work out in the second term the way presidents envisioned. But Trump's second term has almost been like a first term, at least initially, right? He came in and voters were giving him the benefit of being the change candidate and being the new candidate that was going to do things differently than his predecessor, because he had a predecessor for the past 4 years. And so that gives Donald Trump some unique opportunities politically if he decides to seize them. The question is whether he will, or whether he's simply going to look at this re-election as much more of a mandate than it actually is. And of course, I hate the term mandate because it's just an overused term, and we forget the fact that all 435 members of Congress that were re-elected or elected also believe they have a mandate to do what they said they were going to do. Of course, these days, Congress doesn't really argue much with the president, but in theory, that's why this term mandate, I think, is dangerous and gets politicians, including Trump, into a lot of trouble.
Nia, David had a useful framing there that voters get tired with the presidents and the presidents get tired with themselves. Somehow I believe Trump will never get tired with himself. I think that might be the one exception. I think he is always entertained by himself, sometimes just for himself. And it's actually one of the, one of his strengths. It's one of the things that keeps him moving forward. Evidence of that obviously was not even in the first 100 days, but his first week in office when he issued this flurry of EOs. How many of those have proved to be substantive in that they've gotten traction and they've actually resulted in meaningful policy changes or have sort of changed the landscape, even if it hasn't happened through the legislative process?
Listen, I think to be determined. I mean, because some of these are going to run aground or kind of wrapped up in the legal process. Some of them were just cosmetic, but cosmetics matter in politics. Cosmetics matter in a culture war. And that is, I think, in many ways, what the purpose of the EO was, to change the culture of Washington, to change the relationship that conservatives had with sort of the language of American politics, the language of American history and culture. You think about him. One EO was renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, renaming Mount Denali to Mount McKinley. President Trump's favorite president, most recent favorite president, at least, because he loved tariffs as much as Trump did. So in that way, I think they were kind of the tip of the spear in terms of the culture wars, in terms of conservatives wanting to grab a foothold in terms of the narrative that Americans tell themselves about this country. So they could have some permanence in that way, in just changing the ways that Americans talk and think about American history. As we know, part of Donald Trump's persona is as this culture warrior who's going to seek revenge, sort of avenge the forgotten folks. And the ways in which their stories, their lives, they feel have been pushed to the side. It is really kind of about this idea of owning the libs. This is a president, and I write this, I've got a piece up now. He is the US president, but he is mostly the MAGA president. This is a president who is not necessarily governing. He continues to campaign as a candidate. I think that's how he sees his presidency. He gave an interview to The Atlantic a couple of days ago, and it's out online now, and he talks about loving what he's doing now. And you can see that bravado, you can see that bluster, you can see him possibly ignoring a lot of the bad news that these recent polls offer him. He said he runs the country and he runs the world, and this is President Trump's dream. He didn't experience that. David sort of alluded to his first term. He didn't experience that in the first term because there was a robust resistance. And then he comes in this second term and really, I think,
with a plan.
The role in the way that he thinks of the American presidency as this sort of imperial king in some ways, with the court of billionaires who are fawning over him. So, it has been dynamic 100 days. I think it's been a transformative 100 days, probably the most transformative 100-day stretch we've seen since FDR. And as far as we know, Trump isn't looking at the polls in the way that he used to, as kind of a barometer and a metric that he needs to fix.
David, I think another thing that the EOs, that initial flurry of EOs, flagged, obviously Trump was willing to sort of press the limits of the law in terms of how much power the executive branch could vest in itself, how much it could supersede the Congress. We've now gone on across a number of different issues, from judges being threatened to citizens being deported without due process, to Trump's own descriptions of how he sees himself in relation to the law. It's moved certainly from just bending the rules to possibly breaking them and challenging the Constitution itself. Does that surprise you that we've gotten here? And how do you feel about some of the perils that it suggests around the horizon?
Yeah, none of this surprises me. I don't think it should surprise anybody. If you listen to Trump campaign the second time, well, for the third time, but for this second term, he was very specific and clear about what he intended to do. Also, an interesting thing here, and this is something we just haven't seen before, at least not since the 19th century, is that because Trump's 2 terms had a gap in them, he was able to spend the middle 4 years reviewing what went right and what went wrong from his point of view, and then take what he learned about the presidency and bring it into this second term. Right. So he was a political novice. He was a governing novice during his first term. He really learned what the levers of the executive branch are. Like every president this century, and going back a little further, he's been more than willing to stretch the bounds of executive authority. It's just that he's done it. He's stretched that rubber band so much more than any of his predecessors. And right now you have a compliant Congress. This is one of the things I wrote about in one of my first columns for Bloomberg Opinion, is the fact that our Congress has really developed, and not just in the Trump years. I mean, this goes back, probably beginning somewhere post Bill Clinton, but it really functions in many ways more like a parliament, where the members of the president's party in Congress function to help the president, or if their party does not hold the White House, to oppose the president. And they don't actually wield the Article 1 powers. We often say 3 co-equal branches of government. Well, the founders that wrote the Constitution in such a way that the legislative branch is the supreme branch, not a co-equal branch, but it basically functions now like a subservient branch. And so that gives Donald Trump all sorts of latitude to stretch the bounds of authority. Now, because there are so many executive orders, and this happens literally every day. If you look at the president's schedule, that's our job, right, Nia? Almost every day is bookended by the president signs executive orders. All of these can be undone by future presidents. All of these could really be undone by Congress if they bother to do it. But in the meantime, I think it's this sort of behavior by presidents, including Trump, but before Trump, that has added to the dysfunctionality of government as voters see it. It's not that everybody has to agree, but when the president and the Congress don't wheel and deal and negotiate and exercise their different powers to produce legislative outcomes, meaning lasting outcomes and consensus outcomes, it leaves voters feeling whiplash. It leaves one side unhappy while the other side is overjoyed. And it creates a scenario where the country doesn't feel politically stable. I think that is one of the biggest problems we have with presidents willing to use the executive pen and a Congress under both parties that just doesn't want to do much of anything.
Nia, to build off what David just said, the southern border has been a source of contention for decades. I think there's very few people that would deny that immigration is part of the lifeblood of the U.S. economy and U.S. culture, and part of the identity of the United States itself. I think Trump wrote in on 2 things. One, a promise to sort of seal the border and make it less porous, and then to deport people he described as criminals. One of the interesting things that's come out of this is, even in some red districts, I think of Chuck Grassley in Iowa most recently, Republican voters are at a minimum agitated, and in some cases are really speaking out that they're happy to have immigration addressed as a process, but they don't want Americans' due process stripped along the way. I guess I keep asking, does that surprise you? I agree with David. There's nothing Trump has done that surprises me. but I'm always interested or curious about how institutions and voters respond to him. That's usually, to me, where the surprises reside. And I'm wondering how you think about how the immigration debate has evolved over the last 100 days.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you flash back to more than 100 days to the Republican National Committee convention, the nominating convention for Donald Trump, there were signs there, right? Mass deportation, and they were cheering the idea of mass deportation. And even some polling suggested that Americans were open to this idea of mass deportation. And part of it, I think, for Trump was conjuring this real image of, plane loads of people being first rounded up, arrested. I don't know that due process was part of the image he was trying to conjure there, and then being sent off somewhere. That sort of imagery hasn't really happened, right? If you think about the numbers which they promised, which I think was a million a year,
No, I mean,
they
I
were
think
far short
actually
of
it was,
that.
at one point it was 11 or 12 million, was the numbers they were floating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Total that they were going to do.
Yeah.
And if you look at the numbers, they're short of where Biden was in his last year in terms of the deportations. I think what you see happening now was immigration had been Donald Trump's strongest issue, and it still is, though you see some bit of shedding of the numbers there and some disappointment. And I think it is mainly because of the process and because of these stories that folks have heard about. Abrego Garcia comes to mind, other people who have been deported, a 2-year-old American citizen. So it's the process of it that Americans seem to be souring on, the lack of due process, the fact that there are people here who have been in this country for a while, who have been paying taxes and have been contributing, who may be targeted, who may end up on a plane to this terrible prison in El Salvador. And so, again, this was a great issue for him. It is still a great issue for him, particularly for the base. But a lot of Americans are disheartened by the way he is going about it. And listen, this is a White House who is going full speed ahead, even when the Supreme Court essentially said you have to bring back Abrego Garcia. They essentially said, no, we don't, right? There's wiggle room here. And if you look at a lot of the polling, most Americans think that he should be brought back, have some due process, and then possibly be deported, but certainly not in the haphazard and cruel way. I think that is part of, I think, what Americans are responding to. There is a haphazardness and there is a cruelty to some of these procedures that the White House seems to revel in. If you think about Kristi Noem going to that prison in El Salvador and posing in front of those shirtless men and saying, this is what will happen to you if you come into our country illegally. Those are the kind of images that I think are starting to really penetrate to average Americans who, again, have neighbors, have friends, have classmates who may have been in this country for a while, have maybe entered illegally, but again, they are neighbors and part of people's communities. And that's why you see people like Chuck Grassley, who's in a Midwestern state, a red state. And listen, they depend on labor. These folks are part of the economy. And so you see some real discontent here. And it shows up now in some of Donald Trump's numbers around immigration.
And David, immigration was some of the wind that lifted Trump's candidacy. Inflation obviously was as well. Average Americans were feeling inflation in their wallets and pocketbooks. I think to a lesser extent, but it was part of his appeal, was his promise to, one, extract the U.S. from military interventions overseas, specifically Ukraine, while standing up tough to China. I think one of the images that's going to come out of the first 100 days is one of the more powerful ones, was that moment when Vladimir Zelensky, Ukraine's leader, was in the Oval Office and got browbeaten by Trump and J.D. Vance. And since then, Trump has been much more verbally, I think, hard on the Ukrainians than on the Russians. I think his goal was to possibly convince Putin as well that it was time to do a deal. But the reality is we're now in a stalemate, it would appear, in Ukraine. And Putin appears to have no intention of going anywhere unless a deal is reached that appears to be very one-sided. How do you read Trump's own disposition to a foreign policy that's been as chaotic and cartwheeling as some of his domestic policies in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't really think there's ever been any coherence to Trump's foreign policy. I think, like any sort of populist disruptor, he's been willing to sort of embrace what we would think of as shibboleths, when it comes to, how the U.S. functions in the world. He's willing to talk to Iran and Iran's leaders. He just initiated negotiations. I remember when Barack Obama back in 2008 said that he was willing to talk to the mullahs. There was a collective freakout, especially on the right, that an American president would talk to these, murderers who wanted to destroy Israel and inflict pain on the United States. So, Trump is willing to do things like that. I think in some ways he's been misunderstood. I think in many ways he's very dovish. I don't think he's comfortable with alliances and entanglements because he can never see the upside in obligation. He looks at obligation as all give and no get. When if you look at NATO, even if we've done most of the heavy lifting, there's been such an economic and geopolitical benefit to the United States. At the same time, Trump is willing to exert American power in bold ways. You look at the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the sort of chief Iranian terrorist during the first term. That's something a lot of presidents would have shied away from, even hawkish Republicans. And so I think, with Trump, it really comes down to whether he's fed it or not. You just showed, and it was so significant, I think, that scene in the Oval Office when Trump, egged on by the vice president, lashed out at Zelensky and basically booted him out of the White House. But then I'm thinking of this most latest picture of Trump and Zelensky from Rome, when they're both there for the funeral of Pope Francis, and they're alone together
in the Vatican, I think.
Yep. Yeah. In just two chairs, nobody else around, and there's nothing hostile about it. And then what do we finally get? We finally get Trump acknowledging on social media that he's being whipsawed by Vladimir Putin, who seems to have no desire to stop his conquest of Ukraine. Well, I mean, any of us could have told him that. I'm sure other people have told him that. But my point is, you can't really pin Trump down. And I'm not saying that's positive. I just think that on the one hand, people sometimes think that he's going to get the United States into a war. He's less likely to do that than anybody. On the other hand, he's more willing to create enemies out of allies because of the way he sees himself and the way he views the United States. I just want to say one more thing here because it's so important. This thing, allies versus adversaries. Trump is friendliest with our adversaries. He seems personally enamored with our adversaries, particularly Russians, for which I can't for the life of me understand. I've asked him about it in interviews, never gotten an answer that seemed to make sense to me. But here's the reaction.
Likes authoritarians. I mean,
here's what he's done. I'm just going to read you this little snippet here from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech from last night. Our old relationship with the United States, based on steadily increasing integration, is over. He then says that we are over the shock of the American betrayal. So this is our neighbor and ally. Canada. And I can, I don't have to tell you that Mark Carney may be the only one saying it because he was in the middle of a campaign and this is how he won. But there are are voters in other democratic countries around the world that are our allies, ostensibly, who are thinking to themselves, the Americans have betrayed us. They don't like us. And by the way, okay, fine, we no longer like them. And the ramifications of that, to the extent that
will
Trump
take a
has any lasting
generation
foreign
to heal.
policy,
Mhm.
is huge,
Mhm.
are
Yeah.
huge.
Nia, the one of the images that you flash at in your column for Bloomberg Opinion today, you sort of look at the 100 days in 5 images, is Elon Musk with a chainsaw over his head. There are so many images from this first 100 days. It's hard to pick them. You've picked some of the most salient ones. Um, uh, we could pick at that image all day long, but the takeaway I wanted to talk to you about was, what has Doge accomplished? One of the other animating forces for Trump 2.0 was right-sizing government, making the federal government more efficient, making sure taxpayers weren't getting ripped off.
All of it. I mean, yeah, this was the express purpose of it, right? Rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. This is the purpose of the chainsaw here. He has taken a chainsaw to the federal government in a sloppy and haphazard way. I think when people heard that Elon Musk was taking this job, even though they had seen what he had done to Twitter and sort of wrecked Twitter, that they sort of thought of it in the Washington way, right? You'd go in, you'd sort of study what was going on, you'd issue it's sort of the Blue Ribbon Commission. You issue a report, and these programs, these people need to be cut. Maybe it would take a couple of months, and most of those recommendations would be ignored. And this was an aim, he said, I think, to slash $2 trillion. And in the process, he has laid waste to really key parts of Americans' foreign policy efforts. You think about what happened with USAID. You think about what's happened to Veterans Affairs, to the Social Security Administration, to the FDA, the HHS department. What is clear is that masses of people have been fired. It's not clear why those people have been fired. It's not clear if firing those people saves money. What is clear is that sort of firing them and having to rehire them in all of the lawsuits also that have come because of this have actually cost taxpayers money. There's a group out that says, I think this has cost something like $135 billion. What we don't know, but will, I think, come to understand in the coming months, is how costly, how much of a burden some of these cuts will be to average Americans who might have to wait, in a longer line or go a longer distance for to talk to somebody from the Social Security Administration, because these offices have been closed. So it has been random. It has been haphazard. Musk is on his way out in the next weeks. He has taken a blowtorch not only to the federal government, but also to his reputation as well. And you see the poll numbers there. But I think of all the surprises that this second Trump term has brought, Elon Musk, at least for me, has been the biggest surprise that Donald Trump gave such power to Elon Musk. Of course, it was his top donor, gave something like $250 million to his campaign. And now Elon Musk has become the sort of poster boy for grift, for oligarchy, for this being an administration that favors billionaires over average Americans. That, at least, is the argument that Democrats are making now and will continue to make, and have made with some success if you look at some of the races that have happened so far. So this, I think, this 100 days mattered, Elon Musk's role, and it'll matter, I think, for generations to come. This idea that the federal government is not a real reliable place for people to work and to be public servants. And so that, I think, will take years to undo as well.
I mean, I think if you want to address federal spending, you have to look at big entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Gutting the staff at agencies is de minimis at the end of the day. I think ultimately, I think Musk has said he's saved taxpayers about $180 billion.
Mm-hmm.
The accounting around that has seemed sketchy, but we'll give him that number. It's still not $2 trillion.
No.
And a recent ProPublica examination suggested that the amount the government is going to have to spend to fix some of the problems that emerged at the IRS and other agencies is going to cost 165 billion through rehirings, et cetera, et cetera. So it appears that we're at, the cost savings have been almost nil, and we've had a lot of disruption. But again, this is an administration that relies on performance art as much as policy. And then speaking of performance art, David, another, obviously huge and more recent moment in this administration is Trump proclaiming a menu of sweeping tariffs on allies, competitors, across the board. Again, he came in as being seen as a more effective steward of the economy, as Republicans typically are for voters vis-a-vis the Democrats. We've now had disruptions in financial markets, predictions that a recession is nigh, and businesses scrambling to figure out how they'll fill their store shelves and meet customers' needs, and consumer sentiment is plunging. This seems to be very much a problem of Trump's own making. Perhaps he had to go here, given how he campaigned, but how does he clean this one up, David?
Yeah, if he reverses course completely, it's cleaned up. I mean, the problem is for a very transactional president that doesn't believe in much, this is something he believes in very deeply. I mean, going back to the 1980s, when I was a kid, Trump, the great businessman, would be on TV talking about the Japanese are taking us to the cleaners because, they were buying Manhattan real estate, and so it goes. I think there was a way to do this, in a way that would have rallied both the support of the American public and our allies, which would have been to take on China because of their malign activities and their goal of supplanting the U.S. as the world's preeminent global superpower. It was a way to rally our allies in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere. But instead, Trump has picked a fight with everybody in a very rude way. And, I think, the president may enjoy this, and I think he often does. I think he's very comfortable with chaos, and he likes being the center of attention. But aside from the fact that I can't find, any I don't want to use the word credible. There are some economists and some thinkers that agree with Trump, but by and large, most economists and economic thinkers will point to history and just say that this sort of tariff regime has never, ever worked, including that period in American history when Trump says it did work. It actually didn't work. But the larger problem here is that in so many of these countries where Trump wants these leaders to come and bend the knee and cut a deal, and notice he won't even give parameters. He says he doesn't want to give parameters. He wants to know what their opening offer is, and maybe he'll change his mind. These leaders have voters too, right? We just saw this north of the border yesterday. So let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that one of these leaders says, oh my God, we need the American market. I think this is a misconception that a lot of policymakers, particularly populist Republicans, have, is that these countries will do anything for the American market to gain access to the American market. But that aside, let's say there are leaders or a leader that says, Trump's right, I need them. So whatever he wants. They've got voters too that are very offended. They don't like the way their countries are being treated. And these leaders, just like our leaders, don't want to be voted out in the next election. And so they're going to play hardball. They're going to look for other avenues for trade. They're going to look for more certainty. And so, yes, Trump could, without saying so, as we've seen in little fits and starts, related to the bond market and, related to pleas from American manufacturers and businesses to lower some of this pain, could backtrack. And if he backtracks and ends up backtracking completely, problem solved, because this is a problem of his own making. I just don't know that he is going to do that. And again, the one area where he doesn't have to do that politically, at least, even though there could be economic repercussions, is with China, given our views of China, but also the rest of the world. It just doesn't seem to be the way Trump is approaching this.
Still a wild card. Nia, we're reaching the end of our time here, but I want to, we got a very interesting question from one of our viewers out there. And before I get to that, we spoke earlier about Trump stretching the limits of the law, undermining the law, taking on the Constitution, a lawlessness that sort of has hung over a cloud over a lot of these various moments in his first 100 days. And now he's on the road again. There's a lot of reports from inside the White House that he realizes that his ratings have tanked and he wants to get out there and touch voters. He's a proficient rallier, as we all know. So he's appearing to get back to his roots. But in the context of all that, one of our viewers asked, Trump has said he's going to seek a second term. And how do your panelists feel about the prospects of that? Is it something that's likely to occur?
Well, listen, I wrote a column on this saying that Trump wants a second term and we should believe him, that he will try to seek one. He has talked about this. Steve Bannon has talked about this incessantly, saying that Trump will run in 2028. You kind of set the stage in terms of the lawlessness, the challenging the Constitution, the ignoring of the Constitution as well. If you flash back to 2021, Donald Trump did not want to give up power, and he summoned a mob to the Capitol to help him hang on to power. That didn't happen, but he has obviously ascended to the White House again, and the idea of Donald Trump, who loves power, who loves dominance, who again believes he runs the world, the idea that he would just walk out of the doors and hand the reins over to the next president, be they a Republican or Democrat, just seems not believable. Listen, I think one impediment, obviously the Constitution, although we had a columnist to argue that possibly he could qualify to run for a third term. Possibly the Constitution allows for that. I think we talked about Trump and imagery, right? The image of Trump is strong as the opposite of Joe Biden in so many ways physically. And so I think one big impediment would be some sort of health reason, right? If he became more infirm, was sort of visibly ill. He
turned 79 in June, by the way.
Yeah, I think his father had Alzheimer's or some form of dementia. I think that would be an impediment, because I think he just wouldn't like the look of himself out there, looking sort of weakened and possibly sickly. I mean, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with him now, but I'm saying if that came to pass, that to me, I think would be a reason that he might not want to be seen and be in public in that way as president. But barring that, I think they will do what they can to figure out if there is a way for Donald Trump to hold on to power. And I'm sure people are like, oh, you're some wild-eyed liberal. I am just repeating what Donald Trump himself said when asked about whether or not this was constitutional. He said there are ways for him to seek a third term.
All right. Well, then maybe the next time we get together, we'll be talking about Trump's first 10,000 days. But barring that, David Drucker and Nia Malika Henderson, you are both columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Tim O'Brien. This has been Bloomberg Opinion's Politics live stream, and we'll see you next week.